Welcome to Activate Your Introvert, the podcast for entrepreneurs and business leaders to help unlock more productivity and creativity so you get a better business. Have you ever been in a room where somebody had so much gravitas that you had to listen to them? I've come to realise that it's not only really senior people, but others as well, whose points carry so much weight that I need to listen. Gravitas could be defined as seriousness and importance of manner, causing feelings of respect and trust. This week's introvert myth to bust is that introverts don't have gravitas. Yep, I've heard that said quite often. Introverts can, some do, and it's a skill that you can develop. This week's guest, Antoinette Dale-Henderson, has literally written the book on the subject. Her book, Leading with Gravitas, Unlock the 6 Keys to Impact and Influence, is definitely worth a read. So, gravitas is not about being the loudest person in the room. It's about having seriousness and what you say carrying weight. You don't have to talk all the time for that. In fact, you may be better off not speaking all the time. So I'm going to go on and ask Antoinette how an introvert can develop gravitas. What introvert myth would you like exposed, or introvert tip discussed? I'd love to hear from you. I'd also like to receive your feedback on iTunes or podchaser.com. And if you'd like me to speak at your conference or help your team, I'd love to speak to you. Contact details are on the cover notes for this episode. Hello, Antoinette, and thank you for joining us on the podcast.
John, how are you?
I'm really good, thank you.
Good, yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Just before we start, would you call yourself an introvert or an extrovert?
I think that underneath it all, I am absolutely an introvert. I really like my own company. I tend to retreat actually when I'm under pressure. I go into my own shell. And, I've certainly fought quite hard against that through my career. I used to have a career in PR, which is very much about putting yourself out there and being noticed, shining brightly. So I think I almost fought against my introversion during my former career. But now that I'm a coach and a speaker, I really notice the difference between, listening when it comes to the coach and speaking when you're at the front of the room and noticing what I am now. And so I think I have now sort of accepted myself as an introvert, but also know and appreciate the importance of being able to dial up my extrovert side as well.
Okay, so you've learned the skills that go with an introvert, and you've learned that you can dial yourself up occasionally. I guess that in a way links onto the gravitas subject, which you're the expert in.
Yeah, so when it comes to gravitas, I think it's really interesting because when we were chatting before, you were saying that introverts that you speak to believe or maybe even have been told that they don't have gravitas, perhaps because they're not the loudest voice in the room. However, this is what I say to people who I work with who have that concern. In all the research that I've conducted and all my observations of people with gravitas, what I have actually found is that in meetings, for example, who stay quiet and listen and observe and take in the information and reflect so that when they do speak, they say something that's so profound, a question that's so earth-shattering that everyone thinks, wow, that's amazing. And that person's gravitas will then really deepen.
So what you're saying is an introvert does not have to be the loudest person and the one that's talking all the time. If they're listening, concentrating on the subject, and then putting in some powerful reflections into the room, they can generally be perceived as having more gravitas than some of the, I guess, continually talking people.
I believe so, yes. I do think, though, it's really important for people who want to increase their visibility and be heard in group situations that they make sure that they, and this is a classic piece of advice, that they do get their voice in the room early. And so one of the pieces of advice that I give people for in meetings is to make sure that even if it's just kind of commenting on pleasantries or, commenting on time of day or what's happening in the weather, in the warm-up at the start of a meeting, they contribute to that so that they've already been noticed and they've already heard their own voice in the room. And so it's a balance, I think, of less is more, so not talking too much, but at the same time making sure that you are involved and you are noticed, so that when you do have something to say, the audience is receptive.
That's really interesting. I love the speak early tip there. As you said, it could be just making sure you comment in the pleasantries part of the meeting. Is there any other way of making sure somebody speaks early?
What I advise people to do is, and I've created this acronym that is really useful for people, whether they are preparing for an interview or preparing for a meeting or even about to give a presentation, is to think about, and the acronym is this, it's OPRAs. The O stands for O. So to start off by thinking about, if you're going into a meeting, for example, what is my objective in this meeting? What is it that I want to achieve? The P stands for people. So then you think about who are the other people in the meeting and what are their objectives? What's going on in their world? The R stands for role. So what role am I here to play in this meeting? And so that role might be, it could be motivator, it could be strategist, it could be morale booster, it could be creative. Depending on what you do, you would be wearing a number of different hats. So think about what role you're going to play in that meeting, which will then determine the A, which is attitude. And so attitude is about your state of mind. Is it appropriate for you to have an attitude of openness or reflectiveness or concern? What attitude is going to be most appropriate? The H stands for hear. What am I going to hear? And this goes back to what we were talking before about when it comes to people with gravitas. Those are the people who listen. They hear more than others. And that's a very, very powerful skill to develop. And then the S, finally, right at the end of the acronym, is for say, which is about what am I going to say? And often if people do any kind of preparation for any sort of meeting, the only thing that they think about is what I'm going to say. And if they haven't done any of the other letters, then sometimes what they say isn't appropriate. And so OPRAs is a really valuable technique for anyone, but particularly introverts, to make sure that their voice does get heard and they get listened to.
I love that. So I'm just going to check I understood it, if that's all right with you. So before the meeting starts, I want to think about OPRAs. My objective, which is the O, the people, the other people in the meeting, and their objectives, which is actually quite an interesting one because, as you say, I don't think a lot of people think about that beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
R for role. What is my role in the meeting? And I guess that could be the official role. It could be a role that you designate yourself. I guess quite often you could designate yourself as the one that's making the meeting more upbeat or more serious, whatever. A is for attitude, which is about the state of mind that you're going to take in the meeting. H for hear. What will I hear? How do you know what you're going to hear in advance of the meeting, Antoinette?
Well, that's about just deciding to, switch on your ears and listen for a start. But then in addition to that, having gone through all the previous letters, you can then think about what do you want to be particularly attuned to? Who do you want to make sure you are paying attention to? Again, like we're saying about the introverts and the extroverts, often we will naturally get drawn to the people who are talking the most and then ignore or not hear the quieter ones. And so the H is relevant here because it's like, how can you make sure that you are listening to everyone who sat around the table or on the conference call or in the Zoom meeting? Make sure that they all have an equal voice.
Okay, so that's quite an interesting one. So H is about hearing and making sure you hear all the voices, because I guess you could also be hearing other introverts in the room and helping them to stand out too, which is, I presume, going to help your gravitas as well because you're boosting other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what we've done O, P, R, A, H. S is for say, which is what are you going to say? so that you can have some prep. And as you said, I think lots of people only ever focus on what they're going to say in a meeting.
Yeah.
That's a fantastically useful acronym. As most introverts tend to be good at planning, it's probably one that they can use. I can see how that will help people get gravitas in meetings, team meetings, other sorts of business meetings. What about in the day-to-day kind of running of the business or chatting to other people? Is there any tips for introverts to increase their gravitas then?
Yeah, so one of the things that I talk about in the gravitas class is it's about how do you respond to the question, what do you do, or what are you up to? We've all heard of the classic elevator pitch, which I think can sound really formulaic and naff and inauthentic, and I don't think it works very well.
Yep.
But at the same time, often when I say to people, what do you say when you introduce yourself? They'll say, oh, well, I just kind of say my name, if I feel really kind of expansive, I say how long I've been working at my company. And, that basically just goes in one ear and out the other. And then in response to the question, what are you up to? Then generally people will say, oh God, I'm really busy. Or they might say, oh, nothing much. I talk about a rocket pitch. And so what's a rocket pitch? Ultimately, if you boil it down, it's about having different cards in your back pocket that you can pull out depending on who you're talking to and the situation that you're in. And those rocket pitch cards have been pre-prepared to evidence the most appropriate qualities that you have to bring that are most appropriate to the person that you're talking to. And so you might have a rocket pitch for a senior stakeholder within your organization, or you might have another rocket pitch altogether for an intern who's just joined your company. Because
Brilliant.
The best way of doing the rocket pitch is by having an example or an anecdote or a story that you can share that evidences your expertise and your personal qualities and the results that you've delivered in such a way that just makes it really compelling and interesting.
Oh, I love that. So what you've got then is a response ready, a rocket pitch ready for different types of people that might ask you questions, but it's much better than what have you been up to? Oh, well, not a lot.
Yeah.
Because those type of questions are very common in all sorts of businesses, and I've heard people completely fluff it, but the rocket pitch will help you to have a bit more gravitas. So Antoinette, we are out of time, I'm afraid, but I'm just going to quickly summarize what I think were the most important points we talked about. We talked about, especially before a meeting, to prepare using Oprahs. We talked about in the meeting, the importance of speaking somewhere early on in the meeting. And the other one didn't really link to meetings at all, apart from it's the how you respond to questions, the rocket pitch, and having different rocket pitches available for different types of people and situation.
That's right, yeah.
Antoinette, if somebody wanted to get hold of you, perhaps come back to you and ask more details, how could they do that?
Well, they could go on to the website, which is www.gravitasprogram.com, and that's GRAVITAS program, PROGRAMME, so the UK spelling.com.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Look forward to catching up with you soon.
All right, thanks, John. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Activate Your Introvert, and I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. I'd love to see your reviews on the iTunes store. Thank you once again, and catch up with you next week.